Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you, Julie, for that wonderful introduction to our problems of the day. Really explains it very, very well. So in terms of today's agenda, just want to talk to you about what we're doing and why we're doing it. Julie's kind of paved the way. Some of you still have problems with file-based workflow, I understand. So we'll talk about that. And then what are the benefits of making a change? Because change is always hard. And then we want to talk about the Air-Ready Master Specs that we published last year and updating this year. And then the Library Master Specs that we've been working on for a year now. And talk about why they're based on IMF of all things. And want to talk about improving automation of your systems with BXF. I don't think many of you here in Canada use BXF. It's used fairly extensively in the United States. It started out as traffic systems, but it's expanded to more than that. Anybody here use BXF at all? All right. Excellent. Okay, I'll cover that for you. And interrupt me at any time. Ask any question, anything you want to know. But I did see the lotto's up to 50 million, and no, I don't know the winning numbers. I wish I did. So, okay. So in keeping with the theme for the day, I want to convince you by the end of this that now is the time to plan for change. You don't do these things overnight. All of your systems have an age and a planning cycle, et cetera, that you migrate through your technologies. And what we're recommending is it's time to plan to migrate to the next generation, to reduce complexity, incompatibility, ambiguity, and deviation. I'll talk more about those. And achieve automation and efficiency at scale using BXF or other methods. Achieve clarity, compliance, and commonality by adopting Bing, our specifications. So it's always good to remind myself of why my boss has sent me here, right? So my boss is Richard Friedel of 20th Century Fox, and so he was interviewed recently, and he said, this is a really interesting time in the business. We've always had change, but this time the change is exceptional. So changes in business and new advertising models, as well as efficiencies, changes in technology, and changes in consumer demand. So you've got the three dimensions changing all at once. In terms of business demand, you probably missed this, but during the recent NAB show, there was an investor's call for Procter & Gamble. And Procter & Gamble announced that they're going to cut $1 billion out of their ad spend. They're not going to cut it out of their airtime. They're still going to demand the same amount of airtime for the same money, but they're saying we broadcasters are so inefficient and have had poor standards adoption and have not migrated. We're so inefficient that they're just going to penalize us and say, I want the same airtime, but I'm going to pay you $1 billion less. That's kind of interesting coming from the CFO. It's the first time I had seen a statement to that effect. And then the changing technical requirements. Some of you have the same color hair as I do, so you probably lived through many of these. You know, when I started, audio was the quality of a phone call for television, right? And then it went to high bandwidth and stereo and 5.1 SAP and audio description, or a described video, I guess here. And then the video, of course, we changed frame rate, color, etc., all of that. But what we've never done is we've never changed all of it at once, right? So if you're making the transition to UHD or soon to make the transition to UHD, everything's in play all at the same time. You know, some people are changing their audio along with their video specs for UHD. Certainly, you know, in terms of the video, you get the resolution, the bit depth, the frame rate, the progressive, you know, two progressive scan if you're interlaced, the color gamut, high dynamic range. And of course, you've got to deal with online first. That's how people are getting their UHD today, primarily. And then some MPVD. So I understand DirecTV now has 220,000 subs that are just dying to get some more UHD programming, and there's not enough programming there for them. And then, of course, in the US, we've got the Spectrum Crunch and ATSC 3.0, and of course, you've got the interactivity that comes with 3.0, which really creates all new advertising models as well as interaction with the programming. So those are the changing technical requirements, and then you know these all too well, right? The explosion in distribution methods. But what's new about them is they now have real business impact. So, you know, in the U.S., when you negotiate with your cable or satellite provider for your network contract, all of a sudden they are throwing in all kinds of requirements for, we want the VOD within so many hours of airing with exactly the same commercial load as what was aired. And of course, for the first 3 days, you get the C3 viewership. So there are shows in the U.S., one I'm aware of at Fox and another one at another network. 33% of the viewership is on VOD with Fox. That makes a difference between whether that show survives or not. Another one, 50%, moved it up into the top 5 programs in the country from VOD viewership. So all of a sudden, these things that were just add-ons before become pretty important to us. Significant revenue from these and other sources. So we used to pay for the programming. The formula was essentially 1/3 of the program production fee came from the initial licensee to the network, and then 1/3 of the revenue for program production came from syndication distribution, and then 1/3 came from international distribution. That model is totally broken these days, but thankfully there are the online revenue sources, and there's real revenue. There's $1 billion a year right there just waiting to be grabbed from the online revenue now. And of course, back when we started some of this, 2007 with the mastering formats, that's for the year Netflix launched, and looked at everything that's happened since then. So there's a reason to deal with the versioning issues now. And just one more thought on this before we get into the technical side, and that is there was an interesting interview of senior technical executives brought together by the DPP and UALA at NAB. And they published a special report out of it called The Need for Speed. And the CFO of 21st Century Fox, Paul Chesborough, said that, other sectors have seen change and responded to it, and other industries have had to deal with transformation, and we're increasingly seeing the disruption in the media. I'm sure you guys see this all the time, right? So, but it is time to move much more quickly in order to execute to see these demands. And then Julie Sterling of Google, so she's their executive director of broadcast relations, and she's saying that, what can they contribute? What can Google contribute to us? Speed and agility for their content partners is their first and foremost driver. Okay, so who's involved in this effort? So for quite a while now, a group of us have been meeting on Wednesdays and Thursdays and occasionally Tuesdays and on a regular basis to define the requirements and to analyze our documents and to try to find the commonality. And I'll talk to you about the benefit of that. So I would like to recognize, Bell Media and CBC, Radio Canada, for their contributions because they have been a big help in working through this process. The advantage of this is, while CBC and Bell Media may have a lot of resources to bring to bear, I can tell you one member of this team had 6 people on every phone call in the beginning. 2 of those people are left employed in the company now. The rest have either retired or gone to staff reduction. And so you think about trying to assemble the resources that you need across any one organization to deal with how many of you really feel comfortable with the HDR space, with the Rec 2020 color space. You think about all those dimensions of technical change, and in any one organization, you used to be able to go assemble, this is my audio expert, this is this, file formats, codecs, wrappers, et cetera. It's getting harder and harder to do in many of these organizations. So having the commonality of bringing resources together from all these organizations, we can get experts together across this pool of resources. So the problem we're trying to solve, as you know, is interoperability and inefficiency. There's too many specifications out there. I say 1 or more per company. One of the companies has 6 specifications. So they've got their broadcast network, they've got some cable networks, they've got a VOD, and they've got an OTT specification. Every one of those costs every one of us money, and I'll explain how in a second. The other problem with the specifications is some of them aren't extremely well written in terms of they interleave some business requirements, some production requirements, some technical requirements in such a way that they almost conflict with one another, and it's very hard to read them properly and really get the gist of what people want. So the key issues we found with the existing specifications, ambiguity in citing specifications. So Julie has already excellently illustrated the issues with with 377M, with MXF. And I know Oliver, co-author of many of the 700 pages of MXF, doesn't like me to say there's 700 pages of MXF, but you know, it had to cover an awful lot of different operations and use cases. So you've got to cite a standard, not just say 377, but what modes and options in 377 do you use? Then there's the deviation. There's one I absolutely love. You know, we follow this standard, except we want 28 channels of audio. But that format doesn't support 28 channels of audio. And then there's the disparity, and this is the legacy workflow, right? Workflows of the past. We've always done it that way. I know that you've never heard that before, but we have actually interviewed people and said, okay, so why is it really that that's in your specification? And actually, in one case, they came back and said, we no longer know why it's still in there. You know, it's been in there forever. So these disparities, differences for the sake of being different, you know, why is ABC different than NBC if it doesn't produce business value at a technical level that makes no sense? So the solution then was to develop commonly supported, that we all agreed to, standards-based specifications. In the UK, you've already heard about the founding of the DPP by the 4 members, but look, at the end of the day, 11 broadcasters said, oh yeah, gee, maybe we don't want to have our own specification and support that and develop that anymore and pay for the differences. They all developed one, they all supported one commonly developed and defined specification. So, you know, standards, I love standards. They're a key enabler. They're essential. I used to run a standards committee. It says, oh, for this particular use case, here's the modes and options in a standard, and here are the right standards to put together to use. And I'll show you that, an example of that in a second. So, you know, these modes and options are important because if you cite the wrong ones, you're going to have the interoperability issues, as Julie's already so eloquently shown you. And the best part is, look, if we get the organization that has the 6 standards to just go to 1, that takes 6 standards off the market. And every one of those are specifications, rather, and every one of those specifications costs us money. So everybody that adopts the specification, we get to tear one up and throw it away, and there's fewer for us all to support, which benefits all of us. So if you're a broadcaster, you get the benefits because you don't have to produce it, maintain it, support it. Julie has lived the life of updating it on a regular basis. That's the life I used to live at Turner years ago, and supported at Fox as well. But also in capital acquisition and support. So you think about, you know, if you're a manufacturer, are you really going to say no to the CBC? If the CBC puts something in their spec, you're going to say no to Bell Media? You're going to say no to CBS? No, if they put something in their spec, the manufacturer's going to adapt their software to support it, even if it's wrong, because they want to make the sale. You know, we used to say an order fixes everything. Well, an order doesn't fix everything, but it breaks some stuff. And that's, so you pay for it in capital acquisition, and then you pay for it in support, because when the manufacturers roll out a new version of software, and that was one of the user stories, guess what? They can't possibly do all the regression testing on their software to make sure it works for you. Bruce Devlin told me that it would have taken 100 years for his last software release with Amberfin to be fully QC'd and regression tested, and they couldn't do that. So you know what happens? They roll it out, and you're the ones that find the bugs. You're the ones that find the issues that aren't there. And I know you do it because I used to live that life. And then the cost of production companies. One of the big costs that's unknown in the early stages of production is who are we going to sell this to and what format are they going to want it in and how are we going to have to do that? And that's a big unknown that gets settled down later on, and who you distribute to and in what formats. And then I'm sure you've never upgraded equipment or made a change mid-season that affected the production company in the format that they distributed in. I know we have, so it's an ongoing cost. And then the manufacturers, as I've already said, supporting all those changes and doing the regression testing and all that. So, you know, this is kind of natural, this workflow formats of the past. We had separate platforms for specific use cases and processing groups. And this is what typically happens in the industry. Just like when we first adopted file formats, we tried to force them to work like videotape, right? Some of you are too young to remember that. But this is task versus process orientation, right? So the task was get something to air, so we'll get a copy for air. The task was then, oh, now we got to do VOD. We'll set up another little group that will do VOD. And the task was, oh, we got to do some online. We'll set up a little team in the corner that will do online. And this started to get out of control. And the problem is that this can't scale to meet the growing demand, so you do need to automate the process and combine these. So with all this in mind, the NABA DPP working group decided that, all right, we're going to have a commonly developed specification. It's going to be commonly agreed to and supported. It's going to be standards-based. And we're going to have it as a document, a written document. But the problem with written documents is they can be misinterpreted. So we're also going to have some XML that you can use if you want to have machine-to-machine control and interoperations. So it needed to be testable. It needed to be unambiguous, standards compliant, strong and persistent metadata associations and definitions, and any differences in the user specs must be there only because they create identified business values. And that's where it comes down to it. And in some cases, guess what? We didn't reach commonality because we actually found there was identified business value in being different. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the business, production, and technical were all interleaved, so we had to de-interleave those. And we wanted to create specific document sections. One, right up front, the first thing you hit, common technical requirements. Then you hit the broadcaster-specific business and production requirements. So last year, we released two. We released this Air Ready Master. This is what you drop on your server and play. And it's a template, and it's available on the NABA website, and you can download it. There's one for MPEG-2, and there's one for AVC, because we had some users that wanted MPEG-2 for their legacy gear that was in place, because they're not going to be able to upgrade for a while, and other people that are already AVC. So those two are up there on the NABA website. As I mentioned, you've got the commonly agreed to technical specifications for audio, video, codec, file format, timecode, captions, and metadata. And then in the appendix, you've got the broadcaster-specific administrative details. So this is how I want my file delivered, what company delivers it. I think Extreme Reach is here, right? Extreme Reach, you deliver files, program files and commercial files to people, and you might specify Extreme Reach in here. And it's your contact for, phone number, email, et cetera, for the organization and all of that. And your file naming conventions, because guess what? Can you believe we couldn't come up with commonality for file naming? I'll bet you don't have commonality for file naming within any one organization here. It's challenging. And then the broadcaster-specific production and post requirements trouble me more than anything else. And then there's the non-common technical requirements. There were some technical things we couldn't agree to. And there was business value to some of the differences that you had, or it would take a while for you to be able to transition to new technical requirements that the existing base of equipment didn't commonly support certain things. And so you have to put those in that are different. And Oliver will talk more to that. The specific post requirements and production requirements, there's one broadcaster in the U.S. that has, I don't know if it's 6 or 7 pages now, of this is the lens, this is the camera, this is the sensor you can use when you are producing a show for our network, right? And I don't think they belong in a program delivery specification. I think that's a separate production specification. But guess what? Their legal contracts where they buy the programming says they'll be in the technical specs. So we've got this section in there. And if you have that need, you can map those into that area. So those, of course, wouldn't be commonly agreed to. EBU tried that years ago and never succeeded. So as far as the Air Ready Masters, they're a year old now. We had some comment. They're based on rules, and I'll show you some examples of the rules that are blocks that you can use across multiple formats, et cetera. And it's like, you don't have to produce new code every time you go to a different specification. And getting the commonality across a large body of specifications around the world is where we're really going to save money. So we had the rules base defined and posted onto the AMWA website. And there were some issues with transparency that some people read IDs as dead HTTP links instead of IDs, so we had to clarify that. And we needed more explanation. So if you go to the AMWA website and you haven't been there for a while, you'll find that the rules base is much more explicit. And of course, it's supported in GitHub these days, so that makes it easier. The other updates, the Air Ready Masters are, I had a college professor who used to say, the art of communication is not to communicate so that people understand what you say. It's to communicate so effectively that you cannot misunderstand. They cannot misunderstand what you say. I didn't get an A on this one. So we had to clarify some AFD because it did get misinterpreted at least once. And we had to do some clarification on audio labeling. One user wanted MPEG-2 at 35 megabits 420. Never used it in a year, now has no intention of using it. Guess what? We're ripping it out and throwing it away because we don't want to support, 2 additional formats there. We confirmed that the audio channels are a maximum of 16. And then in the X9 spec, the AVC spec, we added AAC audio codecs, primarily for the public broadcasters in the U.S. that have some pretty small facilities with tiny technical budgets that were having some problems that we wanted to help them fix. And we clarified in a new table the audio and video encoding parameters so that people couldn't get them wrong. So the AAC simply had stalled, their efforts had stalled, and PBS put some real effort behind this and pushed them forward and got it done. And why did they want it? Because AAC codec is probably supported in every video server that's ever been made, and they've got some of the oldest video servers I've ever seen, and they've got some of the newest video servers I've ever seen, depending on the size of the station. And so it was widely compatible. And of course, the smaller file sizes were a big deal for the small stations in terms of transmission and in terms of storage. It's less lossy, it's higher audio fidelity than some of the codecs that the stations had been using. And the big one is the channel mapping is frozen. So they had big problems with small stations getting channel mappings wrong and getting the wrong things on the air. So this was a big cleanup for them. And just an example, they were using ASO3. Oliver did some testing for them. And, the ASO3 XDCAM files are 618 megabytes. The ones with the AAC are 328 megabytes now, and 2/3 of that savings is just in the audio alone. So for the small stations out in the hinterlands, that becomes very important. So I promised to talk to you about the rules base, and I'm not going to dive in depth into this. Oliver will talk more about it, but what I'd like to point out is you can see some blocks up there: spec ID, segmentation, RDD6, closed captions, CEA 608, 708, etc., and the X8 spec, the MPEG-2 spec. And you also see the same blocks reused in the X9 spec. The fewer variations the manufacturers have to support, the more likely they are to get it right. So that's the whole purpose of doing block-based. And you'll find many of the same blocks are used in the UK and the US, not all, of course, closed captions couldn't be. And so that degree of commonality is what we're trying to achieve to improve interoperability. So I talked about the evolution of or the workflows of the past. I want to talk a little bit about the evolution as we've seen changes in the marketplace, like the VOD with the first 3 days counting for ratings, et cetera. What happened is, they wanted exactly the same load of commercials, interstitials, and programming, et cetera, for VOD that they had for on the air for the first 3 days. And then you can change it out and change the program, reduce the load of the commercials, whatever you want to do. But that first 3 days became very important. And then, of course, things like Hulu. Well, if you're going to do it for VOD, you got to do it for Hulu too, if that viewership is going to count. So there's already kind of emerging in certain areas of these processes. And so what we're trying to do with the library master format is just say, let's get in one package, and from that package, let's do automated receipt, ingest, and QC, automated processing, and out of that, get the files delivered to each one of those use cases. And, and while I show, the same size blocks on the right, guess what? You know, if you look at that bottom one, I didn't list them all here, but I know one group that's producing 35 different variations for the online OTT, and they're producing quite a number of variations for the MPVD. So, you know, we're trying to simplify this and automate it and get you better control of the process. So stepping back to Netflix launching 2007, this was a group that was working within the AMWA, or actually forming the AMWA in 2007. And they had the versioning problem. And, you know, the versioning problem was driven by breaks in the program, language variants, subtitling, you know all the issues, hot start, squeeze credits, cultural and regional regulatory compliance, and repurposing the files for all of that. So this isn't a new problem, it's a 10-year-old problem. So the library master formats that we're working on right now are for this new unified workflow where you want to get in one package and from that make everything you need to go to any distribution point. So that includes the air-ready masters in HD, HD with HDR. So that's going to be a big deal in the U.S. You might have seen Joe Inzerillo the other day from MLBAM say that they're big on 1080p 60 with HDR. And that's becoming very popular in the U.S. primarily due to the spectrum crunch and due to existing infrastructure. A lot of people find they have the infrastructure in place to do 1080p 60, and it wouldn't be that hard to do HDR and 2020 color in that same space, and gives them a few more years on that infrastructure. And quite frankly, when you look at the testing between HD with HDR and UHD with HDR, the TV sets are doing such a great job of up conversion. Only us in the room can usually tell the difference, right? As far as general audience testing, they can't tell the difference between 4K and HD with HDR. So, and the same problems in VOD, we got to do that. And of course, we got to do the same things in online. But the online problem is significant in that you got to get the right resolution scaling for each set of devices that are out there to get that done right. And over the top, you know, Netflix is very demanding, Amazon's very demanding, iTunes, I'm sure you've all had rejections from them. And of course the mobile and interactive file versions. And one of our members in particular, I'll talk just a second about this, is very driven by international distribution versioning. They do a lot of versioning of their product to Europe and to Canada. And the difference in the versioning is just driving them crazy, so they really want to be able to support that. Excuse me. So because of those downstream distributions, this becomes different. We inherit some characteristics from downstream now. So, you know, Netflix, it's got to be, guess what, progressive all the time. It should be native frame rate. It shouldn't have any 3.2 pull down. Well, all those are fine things that you want if you want to do high quality processing. So guess what? Those get inherited into the library master specification, which changes a lot of factors. So I'll quickly run through some use cases here. You already know this one. You're a broadcaster and you want to receive a single package, media package, and use the compositions in it to support all of those versions that I just talked about. Or you got to do it in HD, or you got to do it in UHD. Same problem. The international, I just talked about the versioning for international is driving a lot of people crazy. And if you're a production company, a program producer, God, you can imagine you're producing for ABC, NBC, CBS, CBC, Bell Media, et cetera, and each one is slightly different, and it's really a hassle for them to get this right. And so it will be a big aid to the program producers and production companies, and it gives them back a degree of control, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, about that degree of control that gets returned to them. And then, of course, the program distributors. So you can imagine if you've got a program that's going into syndication, and it was produced for one network, and now you've got to produce all of the distribution copies for all of the platforms that you license it to, it creates a high degree of complexity. And I've already talked probably enough about the equipment and software manufacturers' issues, but they're customized support requirements for each one. This allows them to free up their development resources so they can compete on creative feature issues and not on minor technical issues. Oh, they use big endian and they use little endian, and that really does happen. And so a couple comments here. Bill Baglar, I don't know how many of you know him, but if you've dealt with Sony pictures for delivery, you probably know Bill. Bill was talking about the value of IMF, and he said, you know, when we lived with tape, it was proprietary, you were locked in, and we didn't want that anymore. So when we created IMF, we wanted the essence and the metadata to go all the way through to the production output, and we wanted the flexibility to change with a changing marketplace. And then Arjun Ramathy, if you've dealt with 20th Century Fox, Arjun and Annie Chang, I have to give great tribute to for their work in developing IMF. The two of them probably contributed more, Arjun in the labs, Annie in the document phase. And so, you know, Arjun brings up a good point, which is why I'm talking about the time for change. You know, train's running down the track. The aircraft carrier is running. It's hard to turn. It's hard to change, right? So it's, you know, his big question is fundamentally, where do we introduce it? How do we introduce it? I can tell you they introduced it into their workflow for producing masters for television distribution. And I was talking with one of their guys, when were we in LA? 2 weeks ago. And he said they had a 30-fold improvement in the dreaded efficiency word, but it has been a big change and a big improvement for them. So IMF, you know, it was developed out of ASO2 and a lot of other efforts, MXF, et cetera, by the major studios. And they defined a common set of requirements in a specification back in 2011. And it got standardized by SMPTE in 2013, and some of the elements have been updated this year in 2000, or last year in 2016, at the end of last year. So, whoops, see if I can get to the right slides here. Okay? So, yeah, the IMF standards were not created for broadcast, right? They were created for versioning in the studios. We have the versioning problem. There's nothing in the standards that says we can't use them. And in fact, there's many features they put in there that we need. The SMPTE 2067 suite of IMF standards, as we developed our user requirements, began to map in very closely and really was supportive of what we're doing. So if you look at the IMF standards that the SMPTE has already created and is out there, gee, there's a bunch of them. You know, there's the core constraints for the wrapper, et cetera. There's a composition playlist, essence components, I'll talk about that. And then there's the application suites for, you know, which application am I going to use this for, output profile list, pixels, output profile list, common audio definitions. Folks, which of those standards do you need to use and which modes and options in those standards? Raise your hand if you know. Okay. So, you know, looking at what we're going to talk about today is the core framework, the metadata packing and asset management. And right now we're focused on 2 apps. There's going to be a 3rd app by this time next year that I'll tell you about in a second. But right now we're focused on the HD using JPEG 2000 and 10 bits and the app2E using JPEG 2000 and up to 16 bits and up to 4K max now, but it's going to 8K max. So if I use IMF and I get a delivery, what do I get? I've said package several times, and that's exactly what you get. You get a package, and you open the package, and in it, guess what? Just like FedEx, there's a packing list. The interoperable master package, which is that package is delivered, has to contain a packing list, which describes, guess what? It's an XML file, it's human readable, and it says, here's all the stuff that's in the package. And you can get a complete package or an incomplete package. So those of you that work in international versioning know your subtitles arrive at one point in time and your language subs arrive at another point in time, and you may have to deliver multiple deliveries to get the components together. But in the meantime, don't hold up the whole production for that. At least get the English out for the English folks, and then the French will be right behind it or concurrent with it, and it may take a while to get the Romanian or Italian version. So you can have partial IMPs, or you can have complete IMPs. I would argue that every IMP is a partial until you get every language on earth and every version, etc. And then along with the package and the packing list, you get a map. You get an asset map, and it's another human readable XML document. And it says, oh, here's where the files are, all right? And that's great, because if you're going to automate this ingest into your asset management system or your ingest system, these are the components you need to automate that process. And you can also get, you know, an XML link with the QC of the people that just did the QC before they shipped it to you, and you could verify that against your QC. So you can totally automate the process. But guess what? Don't like these very much because they're gone. The second you unwrap the package and you get it into your asset management system, you don't need these anymore, they're gone. But what do you need? You need a composition playlist, and it's a timeline for playback, and it says essentially use this portion of this audio and that portion of that audio and this portion of this video and that portion of that video on this timeline and play it out, and this is the version that you need for wherever. And then, so you get a set of essence tracks. You get the audio and the video and the captions, subtitles, and you get output profile lists. So the output profile lists are, look, there's a nice little area of metadata in this XML, and guess what? A lot of these that you'll see created today have Netflix in there. So this is the one file format that you need in terms of the output processing, the scaling, the resolution, all of those things, color space, everything, defined in the output and you can do one of these for each one of your distribution clients. And you can do one of these for proxies, but I'll talk to you about that in a second. So the essence tracks, nothing new here, folks. It's OP1A, ASO2. It may be new to you to work with JPEG 2000. All right, so just between us in this room, there's some work going on. I'm sure you followed openly in SMPTE the work to take ProRes and to get ProRes standardized, shall I say? Well, there's an RDD now for ProRes, and there's a mapping of ProRes into MXF now. And if there's a mapping of ProRes into MXF, why couldn't you use MXF and IMF? Because they do with JPEG 2000, and yes, there's work underway, and by this time next year, which is why I'm saying it's now time to plan, those of you who have ProRes workflows will find you can support ProRes in IMF. But for now, we can't do it, but by this time next year, we'll be doing it. And of course, the audio, you know, no more track limitations issues here, whatever you want for 24-bit uncompressed. Data essence. So captions and subtitles are now using IMSC from the web space. You know, SMPTE 2052 was a good start in that direction, and it is supported, but everybody's moving to IMSC subtitle support for time text. And it's because it's broadly supported across a wide number of devices, and you can go in and out of the broadcast space, and you can do some tunneling of broadcast products. So, and then the dynamic metadata that changes over time, I'll talk more about that in a second. So I got caught on this the other day, so I added another slide here, and I'm sorry you have to sit through it, because I took a shortcut. But so you've got the essence tracks, and you want to use the CPL, and here's the CPL, and it defines, you know, the things you want for a composition based on region or time of day or cultural or regulatory requirements, etc. And essentially you take a series of essence tracks and you say, here's the ones I want for the U.S. composition or the U.S. Spanish or the Canadian French or the director's cut or whatever I want. Okay, that's at a high level, that's right. But at the next lower level, let's take a look at the essence tracks and say, all right, so for video, essence track, I've got a master body. So imagine a movie, and I no longer have credits or titles associated with it. It's just the master body that's common across all areas. And then I have another set that is the English titles and English credits, another set that's, and you can imagine all the variations. And indeed, this is an oversimplification as well in that, as you know, if there's a stop sign, and you're going to air it in France, you're going to remove the word stop and you're going to make that sign look like a native French sign. So, so anyway, the CPL then says, oh, on this timeline, use these elements. So you use the English credits and the English titles and the master body, and you've got the U.S. English. Or if you want the Canadian French, use the master body and the French titles and the French credits. I'm sure you get the picture, and you can do this with the audio, et cetera, for described audio. So this is just a simplified version of what you do. So the composition playlist, it's kind of like an EDL. It is timeline-based. It synchronizes the dynamic metadata and essence types that you want to use and essence elements that you want to use. And you can read it as XML. Give up on file names and directory paths. Universally unique IDs are supported throughout IMF, and they're essential to IMF. And in a large automated system, you really need to go to that. And so the composition from the composition playlist, it's, you know, you got to have a CPL to create it, you got to have some track files to create it, and, you know, you create a whole program out of it. So then you've got that composition, but the composition's in what format? So you use the output profile list for the tech spec processing. Remember I said you create one of these for each one of the distributions, so you can have an output profile list that says, here's the technical parameters that you use to take the composition and transcode it into the iTunes model, or the Netflix model, or your air-ready master model, et cetera. So that's how the output profile list works. It just says, you know, here's how you process these compositions to use them in each one of these other domains. And in-house proxies, I kind of flashed on and off there. Look, you probably have a lot of systems that depend on in-house proxies. You know, you probably have sales organizations that want to go out with screener copies. You probably have organizations that need to create subtitles or languaging or all kinds of things. Or you got, in the case of Fox, 4 different MAM systems. Descriptive metadata. I liked pan and scan so much I put it in twice. See, there's good need for that. So there's a lot of variations of this dynamic metadata that can be, and there will be more, I'm sure. So, you know, why did we select this? So we looked at our requirements, and we were going to take a single file in and reprocess it to use for all of this domain, single package. Forgive me, I'll never say file again. Single package. And we're going to reprocess this package to get all of these outputs. So it needed to be a pretty high quality codec because you got all this reprocessing you may do downstream for various applications. So yeah, you can support a high quality codec. I've already talked about the benefits of the packing list and the asset map and the QC reports to automate QC, asset management, ingest, et cetera. It's a real strength. The content playlist, giving you cultural, regulatory, and content-specific requirements for this is the director's cut, or this is the one that we want to run pre-watershed or post-watershed. You know, so you get the sex and violence issues, et cetera, for a region, or you get some regulatory requirements. That's all dealt with in the CPL. And the OPL is the technical performance requirements. You know, what codec do I want this in, what scale do I want this in, et cetera. And of course, don't forget the proxies. See, somebody sold me on that over breakfast at NAB, and I've been hung up on it ever since because I hadn't really thought about the value of it. But the proxies, I think, is a big deal. So we're in the process of writing 2 new specifications. We've got our requirements documents done. We've been kind of holding back a little bit to make sure that our requirements documents were in sync with DPP and EBU because they're doing theirs too right now. This library master spec thing is bigger than just us. So HD will be initially based on App 2 on the, remember, the list of the 2067 application profiles. And then the 2E will support UHD. It's already being used by Netflix. That is what you deliver to Netflix if you deliver UHD today. And I want to say one more thing about 2067 IMF. It's not just NABA. DPP been meeting every week. I was on the call Monday because it wasn't a holiday in the UK. I was on the call Monday with the UK as we went over the mastering format requirements, and we're almost done. One more meeting, maybe 2, and their requirements document will be complete. And there's already people working behind the scenes to draft the way to fulfill those requirements. And I'll say that, you know, in this case, probably 97% of what they've done is common with what we need. So it's very similar. But EBU also is doing the same thing. So it's kind of the first time you see three big organizations, you know, doing this in three spaces around the world. And in this case, don't think of EBU as being the 73 public broadcasters in Europe. They have opened this up to industry. So those people that want to, if you wanted to, you could join the EBU phone calls and participate in the EBU. I'd rather you participate in NABA, but you're welcome to participate in both, as I do. You know, Turner International, Discovery International, some people like that are working in the EBU space to get their needs met. And there's already support from 20 different vendors, and there's a lot of open source tools. Some have been made available from Netflix, some from others. So if you need a CPL editor, you can go on GitHub and find 3 different CPL editors. They're there. So you know, this is really gaining momentum at this point. So as I mentioned, you can go on GitHub. AMWA has our rules base up there, and the Photon project from Netflix is a good example. There are others, but I wanted to spell those out. And then I wanted to talk about CPL cloud-based editor, Marquise, Vortex. Don't know if any of you had a chance to see that. They were showing it kind of privately, but not privately. And if you've looked at Marquise's products before, it probably felt a little heavy for you. It felt like, oh, you know, I'm grading my final edit here, you know, and it's the tools that felt familiar to Hollywood. And the CEO realized that, and she's created a very interesting approach that feels very broadcast-like, and it'll be very familiar to you. And they'll be showing that at IBC. And I mentioned them not to say, you know, go see Marquise specifically, but there is now a trend of manufacturers supporting IMF in a non-studio way, in a more broadcast, familiar, and friendly way. So I think if you go to IBC, you'll see a fair amount of that, and you'll see some announcements in September probably. So if you need more education about IMF, it's a great program within SMPTE. The Sample Material Interchange program has been going on for a while, and that's where you find out what's going on, what's going wrong, where are they having problems with their files, what are the tricks and traps. So you could certainly join SMPTE 35 PM 50. DPP has AS11 sample material interchange events as well, and if you're interested in the AS11 specs, they're exchanging materials and testing them on a regular basis. I think there's another test coming up in 2 months. We've got a new AS9 file courtesy of Oliver Morgan that has created that for PBS. We've just got the materials in to create the new AS11 MPEG-2 file. So we should have those thoroughly vetted and tested. And you know, it's a great way to get involved in the process. I'll also say if you need more education, you know, there's a couple programs I'm aware of. Chris Lennon with Media Answers has an IMF program that he does along with a partner, and you can get it in a 1 or 2 day version, and he's had, you know, road trips to LA, New York, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, a number of places, and you know, he's always looking for somebody to host it, et cetera, in the area. So if you would be interested, I'm sure you could reach out to Chris Lennon at Media Answers. And of course, there's a SMPTE online course. Now, when I cut and pasted this, the July session was not sold out. I'm told it is since sold out. But you know, this is 5 weeks online. Bruce Devlin is doing this. They limit the file size to 20 online, just so they can be true one-on-one interaction, et cetera. But it's a great way to learn about IMF. So one more bit, and I'll take 10 more minutes of your time, if I may, because I promised to talk to you about automating the exchange of video files. And this isn't for everybody, but some have some BXF interests and some BXF installation, and probably more so in the US than here in Canada. But you know, you talk about great. We said we'd produce a document, and you can download the PDFs from the NABA website. But people get documents wrong. So how about doing machine-to-machine exchanges? So, you know, BXF started out as traffic instructions for load this into my automation system. It's expanded into other business systems, into quality control products, and into transcoding as well with the introduction of BXF 5.0. You know, so we kind of, as we were looking across our requirements and how we were going to create an XML document, well, this was a known quantity and it had a fairly good mapping, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but we had some work we had to do, and we worked with them. And SMPTE has just put this through ballot for 5.0, and there's a couple comment resolutions that need to be done, but it's coming along. So rather than specify absolutely everything in the spec, which would be a nice way to do it, but we chose to do only those things that are likely to change and are of interest to the system. So you can specify this is the file I want in a machine-to-machine way if both partners support that, and when you receive it, you can do QC on it. And I know you're just dying to get into an XML schema, so I'm going to take you right down deep into an XML. No, look, at a high level of the structure, you know, you get a content, oh, I want my content delivered. What do I want delivered? I want an air-ready master. And guess what? Within those, you can do file packages, delivery options, time code, on and on and on. But let's not get into all of that, you know. There's the delivery options. I want my file delivered by Extreme Reach, for instance. There's the which specification do I want, MPEG 2 or MPEG 4. There is the encoding, bit depth, bit rate, etc., color subsampling, all of that. And there's the safe areas. That's another area that we couldn't necessarily agree on across the networks, and there wasn't real business advantage of doing it. CBS wants their logos in one place and not necessarily in what I think is a safe area, but anyway, so you get to define it if you want to. And then there's the structure for file timing. And somewhere all my names for the structures disappeared. But anyway, this is file timing structure, so you can, another area we couldn't agree on. In the UK, it's real easy. Everybody was educated at the BBC on how to create a file, and every file begins at 10 o'clock straight up. That's not the way it is in the U.S., and I doubt it's the way it is in Canada. So, so file timing, segment timings, all that still remain unique to the organizations. And then there's the closed captioning structures and how those get done, and tons of metadata. I won't go into the detail. I know you're getting tired of this, but I will stop one more time to talk about QC. So as we started talking about how we're going to do the QC, we became aware that within SMPTE and the BXF workflow, they were already working with a manufacturer that said, a vendor said, I want to be able to specify my QC in BXF. And we said, well, gee, we've been talking to EBU, because EBU has this IOQC program. How many of you are familiar with the EBU periodic table of QC? Okay, well, I got a treat for you. You're going to love this. This is the periodic table of QC, and guess what? These are all little cards that you can drag and drop off into a template, and just about anything you ever wanted to test, you can test. And it is freely and publicly available if you go to the EBU IOQC. So you can build testing templates just by dragging and dropping, and you can look at the parameters that are in the tests, etc. And we've been partnering with them, and it's now supported in BXF. And they've harmonized those. So this isn't richly supported yet in vendor space, but it's going to be. I can tell you this is another one to watch out for, you know, in the September time frame. So, you know, we haven't finished our IMF yet, so IMF is not yet supported, and we look forward in the first part of next year to getting library master specs in the BXF, and we'll be working on that. But right now, what we're working on is to get BXF 5.0 finished so that you can use the existing air-ready master specs and use those for content specification exchange and QC or any of those that you might want to do. So we're trying to get that finished by the end of June. It's looking pretty good. I think we might make that. And so after that, you know, Julie made a point. There's the UHD Air Master Spec needs to be done because it is a mess out there. I did a survey monkey of the industry. You know, there are people who are playing DPX files back on an air server to get UHD. I mean, whatever they could cobble together and get to work, that's what is a UHD service. And I've looked at 30 services around the world. I didn't even know there were 30 services. There's some ugly stuff out there. So that's the next thing that we'll be working on. As soon as we finish the IMF master, we'll move forward with that. And once again, I have to thank CBC for being a host, and I have to thank all of our participants for contributing. Guess what? It's too late for anybody to see this presentation. Actually, we're going to put it online as well. So this is the last time that we will be presenting this in person, but we will be making it available online and on nabanet.com. You can also get the brochure that was handed out here, which is Bob did a wonderful job of helping with a high-level explanation for non-technical people of why this is all important. And also the Air-Ready Master Specs are up there. The updated ones will be there shortly, probably within the next 2 weeks. And then when we finish the IMF specs will be up there. So hopefully I've convinced you that things are changing and it is time to plan, and hope that you see the benefit of adopting the common file format specifications for North America. Thank you very much.